Good evening, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today, we're adapting the first half of Chapter 4, American Life in the 17th Century, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's textbook, The American Pageant.
Today, we do have a guest with us, though. Sir, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi all, I am Teddy, and I will be a guest on this edition.
All right, Teddy, would you like to start us off?
I would love to. So the first section in Chapter 4 is indeed the Unhealthy Chesapeake. Now it starts with, of course, the quote from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, where he describes life as nasty, brutish, and short. And indeed it was in the Chesapeake colonies. For example, diseases like malaria, dysentery, and typhoid killed many of the immigrants who came to the Chesapeake region, which were, of course, mainly young single men. Now, however, this provided a sort of quandary for family life, as there weren't many women. Indeed, the ratio was 6-1. Now, the issue with this is that many of the men struggled to find women, and, of course, family life suffered. This, plus the fact that many women did indeed become pregnant out of wedlock, and when they did have children, the life expectancy for these children was rather short. So indeed, life was nasty, brutish, and short. However, as the immigrants got resistances to many of these diseases, life became better and indeed population expanded. In fact, Virginia, with 59,000 people, by the end of this area, became the largest colony. And indeed, what was the largest part of the economy?
Yes, so the Chesapeake Bay area in Virginia was very good and successful for tobacco cultivation. By 1700, they were exporting 40 million pounds of tobacco per year. Now, more availability of tobacco led to the prices of tobacco plummeting. The farmers, being as intelligent as ever, decided, okay, we'll meet this excessive availability with more availability, which made the prices fall further. We had what was known as the head right system to encourage growth of the Chesapeake by encouraging immigration. Under this system, if an aristocrat sponsored or funded an indentured servant's passage to America, the aristocrat then earned the right to purchase 50 acres of land, undoubtedly at a cheap price, a very cheap price. This meant that the land was being taken up by the rich and it was running out for the poor. Early on, most of the laborers were indentured servants. Indians died too quickly of disease, and Africans were often too expensive. Life was hard for these indentured servants, but there was hope at the end of a 5 to 7 year term for freedom. They also gained freedom dues, and they received things like an axe, some corn seeds, maybe a small parcel of land, although later on, masters became very reluctant to give their indentured servants this parcel of land. Now, Frank, could you tell me about Nat Bacon's rebellion?
Yeah, absolutely. And this stems from what Abe and Teddy were talking about, with people getting less and less land and life being so short and brutish. So by the late 1600s, there were lots of free, poor, landless single men frustrated by the lack of money, land, work, and women, as Teddy and Abe were already talking about. So by 1676, this man named Nathaniel Bacon comes along, and he leads thousands of people in a rebellion against the hostile conditions. These people wanted land, and they were resentful of the Virginia governor William Berkeley's friendly policies towards the Indians. Bacon's men murderously attacked Indian settlements after Berkeley refused to retaliate for a series of savage Indian raids. Then, in the middle of this rebellion, Bacon died of malaria, and Berkeley went on to crush the uprising. Still, Bacon's legacy lived on, giving frustrated poor folks ideas to rebel. And so a bit of paranoia went on for some time afterwards. As America developed, more and more frustrated young men began to be born, and this created a continuous problem for the colonial governments. So, Teddy, Abe told us that the Chesapeake's chief product was tobacco, but under whose labor was this tobacco grown?
Well, in fact, following Columbus's discovery of the New World, actually many of the slaves did not go to the States and instead went to either South America or the West Indies. However, by 1680, many of the landowners who were afraid of things like the Bacon's Rebellion, which our friend over here talked about earlier, afraid of these white servants, now actually moved to slave labor. Indeed. Additionally, as wages increased in England and as less desperate individuals, white individuals, started coming to America, the settlers there needed a new source of labor, and primarily these came from black slaves. Indeed, in 1698, when the Royal Africa Company lost its monopoly on the slave trade that it had previously had from the crown, then many of the Americans actually used capitalism, and as competition increases, so of course does the market for it. And thus many more Africans started coming to America in the 1680s. And indeed, some of these earliest slaves actually were able to gain their freedom and become slaveholders themselves. However, as slaves became a larger part of the population and started replacing whites as servants on these farms, then the differences between servants and not free blacks became even more distinct. And eventually slave codes became established to actually separate whites from blacks. This made it so that slaves and their children would always, for life, be property of their white slaveholders. And indeed, some laws even made teaching slaves to read a crime, and they weren't even allowed to convert to Christianity. So other than this, Abe, how was slave life in America?
So slave life in the Deep South was very tough, as the rice farming in the South, which was very prominent, was a much more arduous task than tobacco farming. It was much more physically straining. But the blacks did, nevertheless, because they accounted for such a large part of the population, leave their mark on the Americas. Many blacks in America evolved their own languages, and which one of the most famous ones was Gullah, and they blended their native tongues with the English. They also contributed to music with instruments like the banjo and the bongo drum. A few of the slaves did become skilled artisans, like carpenters or bricklayers, but most were relegated to this menial work and sweaty labor like clearing swamps. So therefore, there were many revolts that occurred. In 1712, we had the New York Slave Revolt, where 21 blacks were executed after killing about a dozen whites. In 1739, we had the South Carolina Slave Revolt, where slaves along the Stono River tried to march on the Spanish Florida, but they were unsuccessful. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the hierarchy of Southern society?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is just continuing on with this trend that we've seen, where life in the colonies, the different positions that you can fill, it's becoming more stratified, more hierarchical.
There you go.
The social gap between the different planters, farmers, begins to widen. And in Virginia, a clutch of extended clans owns tracts and tracts of real estate and just about dominates the local House of Burgesses, the local Congress. They came to be known as the First Families of Virginia, or FFV. In Virginia, there was often problems with drunkenness, even among slaves, and the largest social group was farmers, big or small. The 5 main stratas of society in the Deep South was first, the great planters, the plantations owners. Second, the small farmers, who didn't really have massive amounts of slaves. Third, the landless whites, who didn't really farm, they simply worked. Fourth, the indentured servants. And then fifth, the slaves. So few cities start to sprout in the South, and schools and churches are slow to develop. Because remember when we said that in the South, cities are more spread out, everything's more spread out across the state, rather than concentrated in a few industrial centers.
Thank you for watching. Please comment,
Like,
and subscribe.
The link to part 2 is in the description. Hope to catch you guys next time.